For decades, it puzzled people. How does one of the most recognizable faces in television history pass away, and within less than 5 hours, disappear from the world completely? No public goodbye. No televised memorial. No final curtain call. Just silence. On the morning of July 3, 2012, Andy Griffith died. And before much of the public even heard the news, he had already been buried.
Why?
Was it secrecy, or something far more personal? And here's a question worth asking from the very beginning. When someone spends a lifetime in front of the world, do they still owe the world anything in the end? To understand those final hours, you have to go back, far away from Hollywood, to a small town in North Carolina. Mount Airy. A quiet place where life moved slowly, where people knew each other, and where simplicity wasn't a trend, it was reality. This is where Andy Samuel Griffith was born in 1926. But his beginnings were far from comfortable. His family struggled. There was little money, little stability, and even less certainty about the future. His father worked wherever he could, carpentry, factory jobs, anything to keep things going. And like many families during that era, survival came before dreams. So ask yourself, how does a boy raised in hardship become a man the entire country trusts and admires? The answer, in Andy's case, began in a place many overlook. A church. Inside those simple wooden walls, something changed. Andy discovered his voice. Not just the sound of it, but its power. He learned that a voice could do more than speak. It could connect. It could comfort. It could make people feel seen. Even as a child, there was something unusual about him. His tone carried warmth, calmness, and a quiet authority. People noticed. And that early spark followed him into school, where he wasn't the top student or the star athlete, but when he stepped onto a stage, everything shifted. His drama teacher saw it clearly and pushed him forward. One person believing in you, how often does that change everything? That belief carried him to the University of North Carolina. For someone from his background, it wasn't just an education, it was a leap of faith. There, he studied music, refined his voice, and began to understand something critical. Talent doesn't belong to the wealthy. It belongs to the persistent. After graduation, he tried teaching. A stable, respectable path. But something kept pulling him back. Performance. So he took a risk. He developed a comedic monologue, a simple story about a man trying to understand a football game. It sounds small, almost forgettable. But it exploded. The recording sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Overnight, Andy Griffith wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was a name. From there, things moved quickly. Broadway, television, film. And then came a role that shocked everyone. In A Face in the Crowd, he played a manipulative, charismatic figure, dark, complex, and unsettling. It proved something important. Andy Griffith wasn't just charming. He was dangerous, as an actor. But here's where things took a turn. Hollywood didn't want that version of him. Audiences didn't want complexity. They wanted comfort. So when a new opportunity came, a small-town sheriff in a quiet fictional place called Mayberry, Andy made a choice. A decision that would define his entire life. Let's pause for a moment and ask something deeper. What happens when the world only loves one version of you and ignores the rest? The Andy Griffith Show premiered in 1960. And something unexpected happened. It didn't just succeed. It became essential. At a time when America was facing uncertainty, social tension, political fear, cultural change, Mayberry offered something rare. Peace. Sheriff Andy Taylor wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't even carry a gun most of the time. He solved problems with patience, with understanding, with kindness. And audiences embraced him like family. Children saw him as a father figure. Adults saw him as the kind of man they wished existed in their own towns. For 8 seasons, the show thrived. It ended at #1, a nearly unheard-of achievement. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. A quiet divide. Because Andy Griffith wasn't Andy Taylor. And the longer the show went on, the wider that gap became. Fans didn't see the difference. To them, he was the sheriff. They approached him in public as if he belonged to them. They expected wisdom, calmness, patience, every moment of every day. But what does that do to a person over time? When your identity becomes a character, where do you go to be yourself? Those closest to him described a complicated man. Warm, yet distant. Generous, yet unpredictable. There were moments of deep kindness, quiet acts that never made headlines. And then there were moments of withdrawal, where even those closest to him felt a wall they couldn't cross. Even his co-stars sensed it. A weight. An internal conflict between who he was and who the world believed him to be. And that weight didn't stay on set. It followed him home. His first marriage, to Barbara Edwards, lasted 2 decades before ending in divorce. 20 years. Think about that. How many unseen moments, arguments, silences, compromises, exist inside a number like that? His second marriage also came to an end. Fame has a cost. And sometimes, it's paid quietly, behind closed doors. So here's another question worth asking. Is success still success, if it slowly takes pieces of your personal life with it? In 1968, at the height of his success, Andy made a decision that shocked almost everyone. He walked away. Not because he failed. Not because audiences left. But because something inside him said it was time. Most people hold on to success as tightly as possible. He let it go. Why? Was it exhaustion? Was it frustration? Or was it something deeper, a need to reclaim himself? After leaving Mayberry behind, Andy spent years trying to redefine his career. He took on different roles, experimented with new formats, and stepped outside the shadow of Sheriff Taylor. But the shadow didn't move. No matter what he did, people still saw Mayberry. They still saw the calm sheriff with the easy smile. Breaking free from that image proved harder than anyone expected. And yet, decades later, he found a new kind of success. In Matlock, he returned to television as a sharp, intelligent defense attorney. It was different, but familiar enough. A man of principle. A calm presence. A figure audiences could trust. And once again, people welcomed him back into their homes. But by then, Andy Griffith was older, wiser, and perhaps more aware of the gap between public image and private reality. Off-screen, his life had begun to quiet down. He married his third wife, Cindy Knight, and this time, things were different. More private. More grounded. Less about the spotlight, more about peace. They lived on Roanoke Island, far from Hollywood's constant noise. And maybe that's where the final chapter of his life truly began. Away from cameras. Away from expectations. Just a man, living his life. But even then, the questions remained. Did he feel fulfilled? Did he ever escape the weight of being Andy Taylor? Or did he eventually make peace with it? In his later years, his health declined. There were heart problems. There were physical limitations. Time, as it does for everyone, began to catch up. And yet, he remained largely out of the public eye. No dramatic interviews. No attempts to reclaim attention. Just quiet living. And then came that morning. July 3rd, 2012. Andy Griffith passed away at the age of 86. But what happened next is what continues to puzzle people. Within hours, less than 5, he was buried. No major announcements beforehand. No large public gathering. It was immediate, intentional, and deeply private. Why? It's a simple question, but the more you sit with it, the heavier it becomes. Why would someone so deeply woven into the fabric of public life choose to leave it so quietly? Some speculated it was to avoid media chaos. After all, the passing of a beloved public figure rarely remains a private moment. It becomes a headline, a spectacle, a timeline of reactions and retrospectives that often overshadow the person at the center of it all. Others believed it was something more personal, a final, deliberate act of control in a life that had long been anything but private. A quiet reclaiming of something that had been slowly eroded over decades. And maybe, that's the real answer. Because after a lifetime of being seen, recognized, and expected to be something for everyone, maybe he simply wanted, in the end, to belong only to himself, and to the few people who truly knew him beyond the screen. No spectacle. No performance. just peace. But that decision opens the door to something deeper, something more uncomfortable. In a world where fame turns lives into stories for public consumption, is choosing silence the most powerful statement of all? Even now, years later, people still revisit those old episodes. They still return to that quiet town, those familiar faces, that steady rhythm of life that feels almost impossible in today's world. There's a comfort there, something gentle, something grounding. And maybe that's part of the legacy. Not the mystery of his passing, not the speed of his burial, but the feeling he left behind. A sense of calm in a chaotic world. A reminder that kindness doesn't need to shout to be heard, that decency doesn't need an audience to matter. And perhaps in the end, he understood something many people spend their entire lives chasing but never quite grasp. That a meaningful life doesn't require a dramatic ending. Sometimes, it just needs to be real. And maybe the greatest mystery isn't why he chose to leave so quietly, but whether, after everything, he finally found the peace he had spent a lifetime giving to others. But to understand that final decision, you have to look at the journey that led there. Because it wasn't a straight path. It wasn't a constant rise. It was something far more human. Why? Because he wanted more. More range. More depth. More control over the kind of stories he told and the characters he became. At the height of his early success, he could have stayed exactly where he was. Safe, loved, predictable. The audience adored him. The role had become iconic. It would have been easy to remain that version of himself forever. But something inside him resisted that. Was it ambition, restlessness, or a quiet fear of being trapped in a single identity? He stepped away. And that decision, bold as it was, came with consequences. Because the industry didn't follow him. The roles that came next didn't carry the same weight. The connection with audiences wasn't as immediate, as effortless. The spotlight, once constant, began to shift elsewhere. And for nearly a decade, he existed in a strange in-between space. Not forgotten, but no longer central. Not irrelevant, but no longer essential. Think about that for a moment. What's harder, never reaching the top, or standing there, feeling the height, the recognition, the certainty, and then watching it slowly slip away? There's a particular kind of silence that follows success. A silence filled with questions. Was it luck? Was it timing? Was it something that can never be repeated? For many, that silence becomes unbearable. But for him, it became something else. A period of reflection, of recalibration, of quiet persistence. And then, in 1986, something shifted. A second act began. A new role, a new setting, a different kind of character, but one that still carried echoes of familiarity. This time, though, things were different behind the scenes. He had more control, more influence, more say in how the story unfolded. And audiences responded. They came back. Not just out of nostalgia, but because there was something genuine there. Something that felt earned, not recreated. He became a television star all over again. But life, as it often does, was already moving in a direction no one could fully see. Because a few years earlier, in 1983, everything had nearly come to a stop. He was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare and frightening neurological disorder. It didn't just slow him down. It took everything. His movement, his independence, his certainty. For a man whose entire life had been built on presence, on being seen, heard, and felt, the experience was devastating in a way that went far beyond the physical. He couldn't move. He didn't know if he ever would again. Imagine that moment. The stillness. The uncertainty. The sudden realization that everything you've built, everything you've depended on, can disappear without warning. What do you hold on to when even your own body feels unfamiliar? And although he eventually recovered, something from that experience never left him. A shift in perspective. A deeper awareness of vulnerability. Of mortality. Of how fragile everything really is. And this is where everything begins to connect. Because from that point forward, he began thinking differently. About life. About fame. About what truly mattered, and what didn't. He had seen what happened when public figures died. The cameras, the crowds, the endless coverage. Grief turned into content. Private moments transformed into public events. And somewhere in all of that noise, something essential was lost. The person. The human being behind the image. And he wanted none of it. So he made a decision. Not impulsive. Not emotional. But clear. Direct. Non-negotiable. When his time came, it would be private. Fast. Final. Now ask yourself, is that selfish? Or is that freedom? On July 3, 2012, that plan became reality. He passed away at his home. No drama. No prolonged public decline. No carefully staged final moments. Just the quiet end of a long and complicated life. And then, something remarkable happened. Everything unfolded exactly as he had intended. Within hours, he was buried on his property. No press. No public ceremony. No spectacle. By the time the world learned what had happened, it was already over. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some people felt hurt. They had followed his life for decades. They had invited his work into their homes, into their routines, into their sense of comfort. To them, it felt personal. They wanted a chance to say goodbye. And they asked a difficult question. Didn't he owe them that? It's a question that lingers, even now. Because when someone becomes part of your life, even through a screen, it's easy to feel a sense of connection that goes beyond entertainment. But others saw it differently. They understood. They saw it not as a denial, but as a declaration. The final act of a man who had spent a lifetime giving to the public, and had finally chosen to keep something for himself. And maybe that's where the real heart of this story lies. Because there were always two versions of him. The one the world knew, and the one he protected. One belonged to millions. The other belonged only to a few. Legally, everything that happened was permitted. The arrangements had been made in advance. The details had been carefully considered. Nothing was rushed. It only felt that way from the outside, because the public wasn't part of the process. Even those closest to him weren't surprised. They didn't question the decision. They recognized it. This was who he was. Someone who valued simplicity. Someone who didn't seek attention for its own sake. Someone who understood that not everything meaningful needs to be shared. His grave remains private. There is no public landmark. No designated place for visitors. No line of people waiting to pay respects. Just quiet land, removed from attention. Exactly as he wanted. But here's where the story becomes something more than just a biography. Because it forces a question that doesn't have an easy answer. What do we really expect from the people we admire? Do we appreciate them? Or do we feel entitled to them? If you're mourning the character, the symbol, the comfort, the familiarity, then maybe the lack of a public farewell feels incomplete. Unfinished. But if you're thinking about the man, the boy who came from humble beginnings, the artist who gave decades of his life to making others feel something, the individual who struggled, stepped away, returned, endured illness, and kept going, then maybe his final decision makes perfect sense. Because after everything, the fame, the pressure, the expectations, what he wanted most was something incredibly simple. Privacy. Not isolation. Not escape. Just the ability to exist, without being watched. And in the end, he got it. No headlines in his final moments. No cameras documenting grief. No performance at the end of his life. Just silence. But here's the paradox that makes this story linger. Even in that silence, he didn't disappear. Because the things he created, the feelings, the memories, the sense of warmth and humanity, are still here. Still playing. Still being discovered by new generations. Still offering the same quiet comfort they always did. So maybe the final question isn't about what he owed the world. Maybe it's something deeper. In a life spent giving so much, isn't it fair to take something back at the end? He did something rare. He drew a line. A clear, unmistakable boundary between the life he performed and the life that was truly his. And perhaps that's the real lesson. Fame has a way of blurring that line, of making people forget where the performance ends and the person begins. But he didn't forget. Not even at the very end. No spectacle. No farewell show. No carefully written final scene. Just a man, choosing his own ending, exactly the way he wanted. And maybe, just maybe, that quiet choice says more than any grand finale ever could.